Robert Durst was a convicted murderer, suspected serial killer, and American real estate heir. The eldest son of New York City real estate magnate Seymour Durst, he garnered attraction as a suspect in the unsolved 1982 disappearance of his first wife, Kathleen McCormack, and the 2000 murder of his longtime friend Susan Berman, and the 2001 killing of his neighbour Morris Black. Acquitted of murdering Black in 2003, Durst didn't face further legal action until his participation in the 2015 documentary miniseries The Jinx led him to being charged with Berman's murder. Durst was convicted in 2021 and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He was also charged with McCormack's murder shortly after his sentencing, but he died in 2022 before a trial could begin. His conviction for Berman's murder was automatically vacated upon his death because his appeal was still pending. Robert Allen Durst was born in New York City on the 12th of April 1943 and grew up in Scarsdale, New York. He was the eldest son of real estate magnate Seymour Durst and his wife Bernice Herstein. His paternal grandfather, Joseph Durst, was originally a Jewish tailor from Austria-Hungary and immigrated to America in 1902 and eventually became a real estate manager and developer, founding the Durst Organization in 1927. Robert's three younger siblings were Douglas, Tommy, and Wendy Durst. When Robert was 7, his mother died by suicide by jumping from the roof of the family's Scarsdale home. He later claimed to have witnessed it, asserting that moments before her death, his father walked him to a window from which he could see her standing on the roof. However, in a March 2015 New York Times interview, his brother Douglas denied that Robert had witnessed the suicide. As children, Robert and Douglas underwent counselling for sibling rivalry. A 1953 psychiatrist report on 10-year-old Robert mentioned personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia. Durst attended Scarsdale High School, where classmates described him as a loner. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics in 1965 from Lehigh University, where he was a member of the varsity lacrosse team and the business manager of the student newspaper, The Brown and White. Later that year, he enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he met Susan Berman, but eventually withdrew from the school and returned to New York in 1969. He then opened a small health food store in Vermont in the early 1970s. He closed the store in 1973 when his father convinced him to return to New York. In 1992, due to Robert's inappropriate conduct, his father broke with tradition and appointed his second son, Douglas, to take over the Durst Organization. As the firstborn, Robert felt entitled to run the company, despite his disdain for it. He claimed that Douglas had stolen what was rightfully owed to him, leading to Robert's estrangement from the rest of his family. He eventually sued for his share of the fortune and was bought out of the family trust for $65 million in 2006. In late 1971, he met dental hygienist Kathleen McCormack. After just 2 dates, he invited her to share his home in Vermont, where she moved in January 1972. After his father pressured him to resettle in New York to work at the Durst Organization, the couple returned to Manhattan, where they married on the 12th of April 1973. At the time of her disappearance, McCormack was a medical student in her 4th and final year at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, hoping to become a pediatrician. She was only a few months short of earning her degree. She was last seen by someone other than Durst on the evening of the 21st of January 1982, where she appeared unexpectedly at a dinner party thrown by her friend Jabret Najami in Newtown, Connecticut. Najami noticed that Kathleen seemed upset and that she was wearing red sweatpants, which Najami found odd, as McCormack never dressed so casually in public. After receiving a phone call from her husband, McCormack left for a cottage in South Salem, New York. Although the couple was known to have fought that evening, Durst initially maintained that he had placed his wife on a commuter train to New York City at Catanoa Rail Station, had a drink with a neighbour, and had spoken to his wife at their Manhattan apartment by telephone later that evening. "That's what I told police," Durst said. "I was hoping that would just make everything go away." He subsequently admitted that he went home and went to bed. The two women were supposed to meet up the next day at the Lionsgate, a Manhattan pub. When Kathleen failed to appear, Najami grew concerned and repeatedly called the police over the course of several days. Later that week, Durst reported his wife missing. Both the doorman and the building superintendent at the couple's apartment on Riverside Drive claimed to have seen McCormack at the building on the 1st of February, the day after she was last indisputably seen. The doorman additionally said that he'd only seen her from behind and from half a block away, and as a result, couldn't be certain that it was her. A private investigator hired by Durst's lawyer later reported that the doorman said he had not seen McCormack arrive at all and might not have even been working the night she disappeared. Only 3 weeks after Robert had reported his wife missing, the superintendent on Riverside Drive found some of her possessions in the building's trash compactor. 3 weeks before her disappearance, McCormack had been treated at the Bronx Jacobi Medical Center for facial bruises. She told a friend that Durst had beaten her, but didn't press charges of the incident. She then asked Durst for a $250,000 divorce settlement. Instead, he cancelled her credit card, removed her name from the joint bank account, and refused to pay her medical school tuition. At the time of her disappearance, Durst had been dating Prudence Farrow, Mia Farrow's sister, for 3 years and were living in separate apartments. Durst initially offered $100,000 for his wife's return and then reduced the award to just $15,000. When one of McCormack's friends and a sister learned that she had been reported missing, they broke into a South Salem cottage hoping to find her. Instead, they discovered the residence ransacked, McCormack's mail unopened, and her belongings in the trash. After McCormack's disappearance, the NYPD said that Durst had claimed to have last spoken to her when she had called from the Riverside Drive apartment. He maintained that the last time he had seen her was at Catanoa Station, where she was planning to board a 9:15 p.m. train to Manhattan. He also claimed on the 4th of February, the supervisor at the medical school telephoned him to say that she'd been absent from class all week after calling in sick on the 1st of February. Whether McCormack herself had made that call is unknown. Durst divorced McCormack 8 years after her disappearance, claiming spousal abandonment. In 2016, her family asked to have Kathleen declared legally dead, a request that was granted the following year. Kathleen's mother, Anne McCormack, attempted to sue Durst for $100 million, alleging that he had killed her daughter and deprived her parents of the right to bury her. Her parents have now sadly passed away. Kathleen's younger sister, Mary McCormack Hughes, also believes that Durst murdered her. The New York State Police quietly reopened the criminal investigation into the disappearance in 1999, searching the South Salem cottage for the first time. The investigation became public in November 2000. In August 2019, a wrongful death lawsuit against Durst, filed by another of McCormack's sisters, Carol Belmonte, was dismissed on the grounds that she had waited too long to sue. In 2018, the US Court of Appeals had revised the date of McCormack's death to match the January 1982 day she disappeared. On the 17th of May, 2021, during Durst's trial for Berman's murder, Westchester County District Attorney Mimi Roker announced that McCormack's disappearance had been reclassified as a murder and would be reinvestigated. In October 2021, shortly after Durst's first-degree conviction in the Berman case, Westchester County prosecutors announced that they would empanel a grand jury to explore charges against Durst in the McCormack case. He was officially charged with her murder on the 22nd of August, 2021. Susan Berman, a longtime friend of Durst's, who had facilitated his public alibi after McCormack's disappearance, was the daughter of David Berman, a major Jewish-American organized crime figure who dominated illegal gambling in Depression-era Minneapolis and later took over the Flamingo Hotel and Casino on the Las Vegas Strip. On the 24th of December 2000, Berman was found murdered execution-style in a home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, after her neighbors called the police to report that her door was open and one of her dogs was loose. A few days later, a letter addressed to the Beverly Hills Police Department, postmarked the 23rd of December, contained Berman's address and the word cadaver. On the envelope, Beverly was misspelled as Beverly. Durst is known to have been in Northern California days before her death and to have flown from San Francisco to New York the night before her body was discovered. Berman had recently received $50,000 from Durst in 2 payments. Although Durst confirmed to the LAPD that he had sent Berman $25,000 and faxed investigators a copy of a 1982 deposition regarding his missing wife, he declined to be further questioned about her murder. Durst said in a 2005 deposition that Berman called him shortly before her death to say that the LAPD wanted to talk to her about McCormack's disappearance. A study of case notes by The Guardian cast doubt on whether the LAPD had made such a call or whether then Westchester County District Attorney Jeanine Pirro had scheduled an interview with Berman at all. After being tipped off by his sister Wendy that the McCormack investigation had been reopened, Durst went into hiding and moved to Galveston, Texas, disguising himself as a mute woman to avoid police inquiries. Berman biographer Kathy Scott had asserted that Durst killed Berman because she knew too much about his wife's disappearance. Morris Jack Julius Black was born on the 21st of October 1929 in Malden, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, to Fagel Fanny and Samuel Black, and was one of 6 children. In childhood, he contracted polio and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. His parents suffered from mental problems and the children were placed in foster care. The siblings accused their father of sexual abuse, in which Morris allegedly participated. He joined the Merchant Marines at the age of 18, returning in the 1950s. In 1972, he became co-owner of a building near Boston Harbor. The city foreclosed on him in 1976, taking possession of the building. In 1980, he purchased the 3-story Boston tenement. Neighbors recall him as personally evicting a resident by force for dealing drugs, rather than calling the police. In late 1981, he rented the space from a barber shop and worked repairing watches. The following year, he returned to Boston. In 1987, he sold the tenement and moved south. From 1988 to July 1994, he lived in Galena Park, Texas. From September 1994 to June 1995, he lived in Long Beach, Mississippi. On the 6th of October 1997, he was arrested in North Charleston, South Carolina, after a telephone dispute over a $50 bill in which he threatened to blow up a South Carolina electric and gas company. He spent the night in jail and was convicted of a misdemeanor and sentenced to community service. After a time living in Brownsville in October 1998, he moved to Galveston. In November 1999, he moved into his final residence on Avenue K. On the 15th of November 2000, Galveston landlord Klaus Rien Dillman was contacted by telephone by a man claiming to serve as an aide to a deaf-mute woman named Dorothy Sinner. On the 9th of October 2001, Durst was arrested in Galveston shortly after body parts belonging to his then elderly neighbour, 71-year-old Morris Black, were found floating in Galveston Bay. Durst was released on a $250,000 bail and missed a court hearing on the 16th of October, and a warrant was issued for his arrest on a charge of bail jumping. On the 30th of November, he was caught inside a Wegmans supermarket in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after trying to shoplift Band-Aids, a newspaper, and a chicken salad sandwich, despite having $500 in cash in his pocket. Among the items discovered in his rental car were $37,000 in cash, 2 guns, marijuana, Black's driver's license, and directions to Gilbert and Chami's home in Connecticut. He also used his time on the run to stalk his brother Douglas, visiting the driveway of his home in Catanoa, New York, while armed. He employed defense attorney John Waldron while he was held on charges in Pennsylvania. He was eventually extradited to Texas for trial. In 2003, he was tried for the murder of Morris Black. On the death of Black, the prosecution presented the jury with only a charge of capital murder with no lesser murder or manslaughter charges. Durst employed defense attorney Dick DeGuerin and claimed self-defense. DeGuerin conducted 2 mock trials in preparation for the case. Durst's defense team found communicating with him to be difficult and hired psychiatrist Milton Altshuter to investigate. After spending 70 hours examining him, Altshuter diagnosed Durst with Asperger's syndrome, stating, his defense team argued at trial that the diagnosis explained his behavior. Durst claimed that Black, a cranky and confrontational loner, grabbed his .22 caliber target pistol from its hiding place and threatened him with it. During the struggle for the pistol, the weapon discharged and shot Black in the face. During cross-examination, Durst admitted to using a paring knife, 2 saws, and an axe to dismember Black's body before bagging and dumping his remains in Galveston Bay. Black's head was never recovered, so prosecutors were unable to present sufficient forensic evidence to dispute Durst's account of the struggle. As a result of lack of forensics, the jury acquitted Durst of the murder on the 11th of November 2003. On the 21st of December 2004, Durst pleaded guilty to 2 counts of bail jumping and 1 count of evidence tampering for his dismemberment of Black's body. As part of a plea bargain, he received a sentence for 5 years and was given credit for time served, requiring him to only serve 3 years in prison. He was paroled in July 2005. The rules of his release required him to stay near his home. Permission was required for him to travel. However, that December, he made an unauthorized trip to the boarding house where Black was killed and to a nearby shopping mall. At the mall, he ran into former Galveston trial judge Susan Criss, who had presided over his trial. Due to this incident, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles determined that he had violated the terms of his parole and was returned to jail. He was released again from custody on the 1st of March 2006. Asked in March 2015 whether he believed Durst murdered Black, Criss commented, Private investigator Bobby Backer argues Morris Black had known Durst years prior and was likely involved in the disappearance of Durst's first wife, Kathleen, in 1982. Durst's notoriety inspired the 2010 film All Good Things, the title of which is a reference to the Vermont health food store of the same name set up by Durst and McCormack. David Marks, the character based on Durst, was portrayed by Ryan Gosling, and his wife Katie was portrayed by Kirsten Dunst. Shortly after its theatrical release, Durst contacted director Andrew Jarecki and expressed his approval of the film, which evolved into discussions between them of them being included in the DVD video release, and eventually resulting in Jarecki co-writing, co-producing, directing, and appearing in the 2015 documentary miniseries The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, which was broadcast on HBO. During the production of The Jinx, Susan Berman's stepson uncovered a 1999 letter written by Durst which contained the same Beverly Hills typographical error as the anonymous letter directing police to Berman's body, implicating Durst in the murder. Jarecki and producers Mark Smerling and Zach Stewart Pontier realized they had uncovered potential criminal evidence and delivered the second letter to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The new information led to Durst's indictment for the first-degree murder of Berman. The FBI arrested Durst in New Orleans on the eve of the broadcast of the final episode of The Jinx. The Jinx ends with Durst moving into a bathroom where his microphone records him seemingly saying to himself, "There it is, you're caught. You're right, of course. But you can't imagine the rest of them. I don't know what was in the house. Oh, I want this. What a disaster. He was right. I was wrong. And all the burping, I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." It later became known in 2019 the filmmakers altered the sequence of Durst's comments, increasing the apparent severity of his musings in the bathroom. In November 2023, HBO announced The Jinx Part 2, a 6-episode continuation of the series, was in production with the same producers and director and premiered on the 21st of April 2024. Part 2 covers the 8 years between the original series in 2015 to present time, including new interviews, hidden material, and Durst's prison calls. On the 14th of March 2015, a few days after a first-degree murder warrant was signed by a Los Angeles judge alleging a role by Durst in relation to the Berman killing, Durst was arrested by FBI agents at the Canal Street Marriott in New Orleans, where he was registered under the false name Everett Ward. Durst, who'd been tracked to the hotel after making two calls to check his voicemail, was observed wandering aimlessly in the lobby and mumbling to himself, having driven to New Orleans from Houston 4 days before. In addition to a .35 caliber revolver loaded with 4 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing, police recovered 5 ounces of marijuana, his birth certificate and passport, maps of Louisiana, Florida, and Cuba, a flesh-toned latex mask, the fake Texas ID he used to check into the hotel, and cash totaling $42,631. Police discovered a UPS tracking number, which led to an additional $117,000 cash and a pair of shoes in a package sent to Durst by a friend in New York, which was seized after his arrest. Bank statements found in one of Durst's Houston condominiums revealed cash withdrawals of $350,000 in little more than a month. He's believed to have planned to flee to Cuba after the HBO documentary aired, since the US and Cuba have no extradition treaty. On the 15th of April 2015, New York State Police investigator Joseph Barreca, long involved with the McCormack case, and said to have been working closely with the FBI and Los Angeles detectives, removed around 60 file boxes of Durst's personal papers and effects from the home of Durst's friend Susan T. Giordano in Campbell Hall, New York. All of these items had been sent to Giordano for safekeeping 3 years prior by Durst's then-wife, Deborah Lee Charton. Also stored at Giordano's residence were videotaped depositions of Durst, his brother Douglas, and Charton, all of which were related to the Black case. Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney John Lewis, in charge of prosecuting Durst, immediately flew to New Orleans after his arrest. With Durst's permission, Lewin interviewed him for 3 hours without a lawyer present. The recorded questioning was later introduced as evidence in the Berman trial. In regards to the investigation, Lewin claimed to have found information uncovered by the filmmakers, the Jinx, to be compelling, and repeatedly flew to New York to interview witnesses, including friends of Durst and Berman's. On the 16th of March 2015, Dick Duguayrin advised court authorities in New Orleans that Durst waived extradition and would voluntarily return to California. Later that same day, Louisiana State Police filed charges against Durst for being a felon in possession of a firearm and for possession of a firearm with a controlled substance, forestalling his immediate return to California. Orleans Parish District Attorney Leon Canizaro commented, in light of prior convictions that could influence Durst's sentencing, just for those gun charges here in Louisiana, Durst could face up to life in prison. On the 23rd of March, Durst was denied bail by a Louisiana judge after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk. In an effort to hasten his extradition to California and avoid a protracted court battle in Louisiana, Duguayrin raised questions about the validity of the New Orleans arrest and hotel room search, observing a local judge didn't issue a warrant until hours after his client was detained. While communicating with the LAPD and conducting an inventory of Durst's hotel room possessions, the FBI held him there incommunicado for almost 8 hours. According to Duguayrin, Durst was questioned extensively by a Los Angeles prosecutor and detective without a lawyer present on the morning after his arrest. In failing to produce the arresting officers subpoenaed for probable cause hearing, Durst's attorneys charged that Louisiana prosecutors engaged in a misguided attempt to conceal the facts from the court, the defendant, and the public. Peter Mansfield, an assistant U.S. attorney, said that his office instructed the 2 FBI agents and arresting officer not to appear, arguing that Duguayrin's subpoenas were issued in an attempt to conduct actions against them in their official capacities for the purpose of abstaining testimony, information, and material maintained under the colour of their official duties. On the 8th of April, a day after the U.S. Attorney filed an independent federal weapons charge, Durst was formally indicted by a Louisiana grand jury for carrying a weapon with a controlled substance and for the illegal possession of a firearm by a felon. Later that month, his lawyers requested that more than $193,000 seized by authorities during their searches to be returned, saying the cash is not needed as evidence, is not contraband, and is not subject to forfeiture. After negotiations with his defense team, Louisiana authorities ultimately dropped weapons charges against him on the 23rd of April 2015. His trial on the federal weapons charge was scheduled for the 21st of September 2015. Duguayrin confirmed rumours Durst was in poor health, stating that he suffered from hydrocephalus and had a stunt put into his skull 2 years before, as well as a spinal surgery and a cancerous mass removed from his esophagus. Durst's attorneys requested a later date for the federal weapons trial, saying that they would need more time to prepare after rulings on pending motions. U.S. District Judge Helen Barragan later rescheduled the trial for the 11th of January 2016. On the 16th of November 2015, a New Orleans federal judge ordered Durst rearraigned on the weapons charge and scheduled the hearing for the 17th of December. When asked, his attorney said only that Durst didn't kill Berman and that he wanted to resolve the other charges to expedite Durst's extradition to Los Angeles to face that charge. On the 16th of December 2015, prosecutors and defense attorneys told Berrigan in a joint motion that scheduling conflicts ruled out all dates before the 11th of January trial date. Berrigan ultimately rescheduled the trial for the 3rd of February 2016, and Durst changed his plea to guilty to the federal gun charge and received an 85-month prison sentence. Durst's trial concerning the Berman killing was scheduled to begin in Los Angeles after Durst was arraigned in California, but his transfer was delayed by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons due to serious surgery, according to Duguayrin. A conditional hearing was convened in February 2017 where Nick Chavin, a close friend of Durst's, and whose wedding Durst served as best man, testified that Durst had personally confided to having murdered Berman. A preliminary hearing was initially scheduled for October 2017, but was postponed to April 2018 to accommodate Durst's defense team, some of whom had suffered damage to the homes and offices from Hurricane Harvey. The pretrial hearings included extensive testimony from a number of older witnesses who potentially would not be available when the trial itself began. In October 2018, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Mark Windham ruled that enough evidence existed to try Durst for the murder of Berman, and that he would be arraigned on the 8th of November 2018. During his court appearance the following day, Durst pleaded not guilty. In January 2019, Wyndham set Durst's trial date as the 3rd of September 2019. At the same time, Judge Wyndham ruled that prosecutors would present evidence involving the Black murder. Prosecutors would try to connect Berman's murder with McCormack's disappearance, which they argued was the foundation for the motive of the murder. In his ruling that prosecutors could use evidence from the Texas case, Judge Wyndham said that the killings of Black and Berman seemed to be intertwined. The murder charge against Durst included the special circumstance allegations of lying in wait and killing a witness to a crime. It was further alleged that Durst had used a handgun to carry out the murder. In May 2019, a motion filed by Durst's attorneys claimed 2 handwriting samples, the anonymous cadaver note to Beverly Hills Police, and a letter in 1999 obtained from Durst to Berman, along with other evidence from his 2015 arrests, were obtained in violation of the 4th Amendment, thus moving for their exclusion. On the 8th of May, Los Angeles County prosecutors filed an affidavit replying to the motion, charging that Durst was creating an elaborate conspiracy theory between the HBO filmmakers, law enforcement officers, and the Los Angeles County District Attorney Office to make Durst incriminate himself. On the 17th of May, Wyndham granted Durst's defense team a 4-month postponement of the trial after they raised concerns about the volume of evidence in the case that conflicts with attorney schedules. On the 3rd of September 2019, Wyndham rejected an attempt by Durst's attorneys to strip the prosecutors of the jinx of protection under the California's Journalist Shield Law by having them declared government agents. A number of other procedural rulings also went against Durst. Lewin set another hearing on discovery and other matters for the 28th of October. Additional evidential hearings were held in December 2019 regarding the admissibility of statements Durst made in March 2015, just after his arrest in New Orleans, in an interview with Lewin. In a surprise move, on the 24th of December 2019, Durst's lawyers contradicted his previous statements and filed court documents admitting that Durst wrote the cadaver note. In all previous statements, Durst consistently had denied writing the note, although the handwriting appeared to be similar to his own, as the misspelling of the word Beverly contained in the prior letter to Berman that Durst admitted to authoring. During the filming of The Jinx, Durst told filmmakers that the person who wrote the cadaver note was taking a big risk because it was something that only the killer would have written. He told his godson, Howard Altman, the person who wrote the note killed her. However, in August 2019, his attorneys also argued what the note demonstrates is that the person who mailed it was aware that there was a body at the house, not that the individual murdered Susan Berman. On the 2nd of March 2020, he appeared in court to begin his trial, which was expected to take several months. However, the proceedings were postponed amid the pandemic. In June 2020, a motion by the defence for the mistrial cause of the delay was denied. The following month, Wyndham ruled that a further delay until April 2021 was necessary due to the pandemic, but would allow the trial to proceed if Durst agreed to a bench trial without a jury. Durst declined this option, and the trial was scheduled to resume on the 12th of April 2021. It was then postponed until the 17th of May 2021. On the 13th of May 2021, his lawyers filed a motion with the court saying that he developed bladder cancer and moved that the court postpone the trial indefinitely and to release him on bail to receive medical treatment that was currently being provided. The motion was denied by the court and the trial resumed on the 17th of May, with Wyndham questioning jurors about whether they could still remain neutral in a case after a 14-month break. On the 10th of June 2021, Durst was hospitalised after being found down and not in his wheelchair. Wyndham sent the jury home with plans to resume on the 14th of June. Lewin expressed suspicion that the defendant was faking a medical crisis to force a mistrial because he was, on record, in his calls from county jail saying that he intended to feign dementia or seek a mistrial due to COVID-19. I have no idea whether this is legitimate or not, but obviously, given his history, it's certainly suspect as to what his actual condition is, Lewin said. Noting that Durst's lawyers had twice sought mistrials during the previous day's testimony, the prosecutor added, "It's very clear that the defence and the defendant want this trial to go away." Jail doctors determined Durst was able to appear in court after an emergency hospitalization, which was for a urinary tract infection and sepsis, and Wyndham reconvened the trial on the 14th of June. Durst was unable to dress himself and was in court in his wheelchair jail uniform with a catheter bag and covered in a large blanket. As testimony continued, his brother Douglas appeared as a prosecution witness on the 28th of June 2021, saying that he was reluctant to appear at the trial and was doing so under the threat of subpoena. Douglas was asked about his relationship with his brother. On the 29th of June 2021, Durst's defence team asked again for an emergency halt to the case based on his poor medical condition, saying that he wasn't able to testify on his own behalf, but was again rejected on the 2nd of August, with Wyndham giving numerous examples of Durst's competency. The prosecution closed this case against Durst after 11 weeks of presenting evidence, preliminary consisting of friends and associates of Berman saying that she told them she was the alibi for Durst when his wife disappeared, and that he'd done something and she needed to do something as well. Shavin tasted that Durst told him, "I had to, it was her or me, I had no choice." The defence opening case with extensive testimony from false memory expert Elizabeth Loftus, questioning the decades ago recollections of prosecution witnesses. Although highly unusual for a murder case, Durst himself was expected to testify on his own behalf on the 5th of August 2021. The court was adjourned until the 9th of August due to a positive COVID test of a relative of Durst's legal team who had been attending the trial. Durst appeared on the stand for 14 days under questioning from Levin, who gave seemingly endless examples of Durst's prosperity to lie. Lewin concerned Durst to the point he admitted lying while under oath in the Morris Black trial in 2003, and that he lied 5 times whilst on the stand in the present trial. Durst and Loftus were the only witnesses the defence called. On the 14th of September 2021, the jury was charged with reaching a verdict by Judge Wyndham. On the 17th of April 2021, the jury convicted Durst for the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. Durst thus faced the possibility of a life sentence. He was also found guilty of multiple special charges. His lawyer said that they were disappointed and would pursue all avenues of appeal. On the 24th of September, his lawyers filed a motion with Wyndham request a new trial. The reasoning was basically the same as they gave in Durst's trial defence. No physical evidence was presented, witnesses for the prosecution were not to be believed, and that the entire prosecution case was nothing but an unproven theory. On the 14th of October 2021, Durst was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Berman's murder. The request from Durst for a new trial was denied by the court in view of the abundance of evidence of Durst's guilt. Following the murder conviction, Durst's legal team immediately filed appeals in the California legal system. As such, his appeals may be dismissed by the California Court of Appeal as the conviction set aside, as his death prevented the appeals from being heard. Days after the Berman murder, police were reportedly examining connections between Durst and the disappearances of 18-year-old Lynn Schluzzi from Middlebury, Vermont, and 16-year-old Karen Mitchell from Eureka, California. Investigators were also considering a possible connection between Durst and the disappearance of 18-year-old Kristen Modreffi, who was last seen in San Francisco in 1997. Schluz, a Middlebury College freshman, visited Durst's health food store on the 10th of December 1971, the day she disappeared, and was last seen that afternoon near a bus stop across from the store. Author and investigative journalist Matt Birkbeck reported in 2003 and again in his 2015 book, A Deadly Secret, that credit card records placed Durst in Eureka on the 25th of November 1997, the day Mitchell vanished. She may have volunteered in a homeless shelter that Durst frequented. Durst, dressed in women's clothing, had visited the Eureka shoe store owned by Mitchell's aunt. Mitchell was last seen walking to work from her aunt's store and possibly speaking to someone in a stopped car. A witness sketch of Mitchell's presumed abductor resembles Durst. Although the FBI ultimately couldn't connect Durst to the Long Island serial murders, in which some victims were disposed of in a similar manner to the Black killing, the Bureau created an informal task force in 2012 to work with investigative agencies in jurisdictions where Durst was known to have lived in past decades, including Vermont, New York, and California. In the wake of his arrest, the FBI encouraged such localities to re-examine cold cases. Texas private investigator Bobby Backer also traced Durst operating under stolen identities in Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, New Jersey, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Virginia. On the 11th of December 2000, shortly before the Berman killing, Durst married Deborah Lee Charton. According to the New York Times, the couple had briefly shared a Fifth Avenue apartment in 1990, but have never lived together as husband and wife. Durst once told his sister Wendy that it was a marriage of convenience. I wanted Debbie to be able to receive my inheritance as I intended to kill myself, Durst said in a 2005 deposition. When Durst was arrested for the Black killing in 2001, Charton wired him the $250,000 bail the court required. She also visited Durst in jail and spoke with him on the phone on a regular basis, discussing his legal strategy and other personal and business issues. Following the Black trial, Charton reportedly distanced herself from Durst and his affairs, legal and otherwise. In particular, she specifically told Durst not to get involved with the Jinx, to which he disagreed at the time. Her friend said that after Durst's arrest in 2015, she hadn't spoken with him since the documentary had begun airing in February. Despite still being married to him, she was reported to be living with Stephen I. Holm in 2015. Holm was a real estate attorney in the New York City area who handled transactions for both Durst and Charton. It was reported in Real Estate Weekly that Holm died on the 17th of October 2019 and that Charton was his wife. Charton was called Holm's wife at his funeral, in his obituary online, and in the obituary in the New York Times. Shortly after, Charton sent the Times a letter saying that she and Holm weren't married and asked them to print a retraction. She and Holm were involved with several philanthropic ventures together. Shortly after Durst was convicted of murdering Berman in September 2021, a lawyer for the family of Kathleen McCormack sent Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. a letter claiming the marriage between Durst and Charton was a sham, solely to aid and abet Durst's financial crimes and murders, and to conceal those acts and frustrate investigators. The letter asked Vance's office to investigate these claims and also the issue of Durst being a bigamist because of Charton's publicly claimed marriage to Holm. The letter was the second time the McCormack family asked the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to look into these issues, the first time being in March 2020. Durst travelled and lived under dozens of aliases over the years, using different identities to buy cars, rent apartments, and open credit card accounts. He had a scanner, copier, and a laminating machine, a former office employee of Durst told Newsweek. What I didn't realise was that I unwittingly saw what would have allowed Robert Durst to make a fake driver's licence. Durst was a prolific user of private mailboxes and apparently conducted business under a number of canine-themed names: Woofing LLC, Woof Woof LLC, and Igor Fayette Inc. In the early 1980s, Durst owned a series of 7 Alaskan Malamutes, all of which were named Igor, and all died under mysterious circumstances according to his brother Douglas. In December 2015, prior to the airing of The Jinx, Douglas told The Times, "In retrospect, I now believe he was practicing killing and disposing of his wife with those dogs." Durst was once recorded saying that he wanted to Igor Douglas. Durst, however, has disputed the assertion that he owned 7 dogs named Igor. He owned 3, he said, one that was run over and another that died in surgery after eating an apple core, before the Igor that lasted forever. From 2015 on, Durst had a number of significant medical issues, including major surgeries for esophageal cancer, having a shunt installed in his brain for hydrocephalus, and cervical spinal fusion. When arrested in New Orleans in 2015, he was found to be in possession of a variety of medications, including the sleep aid melatonin, a muscle relaxant, and medications for high blood pressure, blood flow, and acid reflux. During the Berman murder trial, his lawyers told the court that he had bladder cancer. On the 16th of October 2021, he tested positive for COVID and was placed on a ventilator. At his sentencing 2 days prior, his defense attorney, Dick DeGering, said Durst was in very bad condition, having a hard time breathing and speaking. It was unknown how Durst had contracted the virus and whether anyone else at the sentencing had been infected. In mid-2002, he signed over power of attorney to Charton, and their holdings are thought to have remained closely intermingled. In 2006, he gave Charton around $20 million of his $65 million trust settlement. In 2011, he purchased a $1.75 million townhouse on Lenox Avenue in Harlem. A source close to the Durst family confirmed that he was living there at least some of the time that they were keeping him under surveillance. He also owned 3 condominiums in a multi-story complex in Houston, and after a filing suit received a $200,000 settlement in 2006 from a Houston developer who refused to let him move into a unit newly purchased by his wife, which she had then immediately resold to Durst for $10. At the time of Berman's murder in Los Angeles, Durst had just sold a home in Trinidad, California, and maintained an office in Eureka whilst renting in nearby Big Lagoon. Media outlets variously reported Durst's financial status as real estate baron, rich scion, millionaire, multimillionaire, and billionaire. As of 2021, the Durst family real estate holdings are worth more than $8 billion, but Durst's brother Douglas has been in control of the Durst organization since the early 1990s. From around 1994 to 2006, Durst waged a legal campaign to gain greater control of the family trust and fortune. During that time, he received $2 million a year from the trust. In 2006, the case was settled, with Durst giving up any interest in the family's properties and trusts in exchange for a one-time payment of about $65 million. How much of that went to legal fees and taxes is unknown. He remained active in real estate. He reportedly sold 2 properties in 2014 for $21.15 million after purchasing them in 2011 for $8.65 million. At the time of his 2015 arrest, the FBI estimated Durst's net worth at approximately $100 million. The New York Times estimated his net worth to be $110 million. On the 1st of May 2015, the New York Post reported that Douglas Durst had settled litigation against Andrew Jarecki, having confirmed that Robert Durst was the source of videotape depositions that appeared in the Jinx. Durst's disclosure apparently violated the terms of his 2006 agreement with the family, which had disbursed him a lump sum of the trust assets. Whether Jarecki confirmed Durst as a source was unclear. The New York Times reported in March 2015 that he was given unrestricted access to Durst's personal records, including the videotaped material, but the settlement paved the way for Douglas to reclaim as much as $74 million of his brother's assets, effectively freezing those assets pending court judgment. This would potentially affect Durst's ability to pay for high-caliber legal representation without tapping into real estate or other investments. The Post reported that Douglas was mulling his next move, but no legal action had been taken. In November 2015, McCormack's three sisters and then 101-year-old mother sued Durst for $100 million, citing his apparent role in a murder and his denial to the family of the right to sepulture, a New York law that grants immediate relatives access to a deceased person's body and the opportunity to determine appropriate burial. If successful, the lawsuit would have relieved Durst's estate of most or all of the fortune he inherited. McCormack's brother James had attempted in October 2015 to file a wrongful death suit against Durst on behalf of his mother, but was challenged by one of his sisters, who held her mother's power of attorney. On the 7th of December 2015, the same family members filed a suit asking the court to freeze Durst's assets. The McCormack family's attorney, Robert Abrams, called Durst the poster child for why courts block defendants from disposing of assets while civil lawsuits are pending. In July 2016, the family asked the Surrogates Court in Manhattan to declare that Kathy died on January 31, 1982, when she was murdered by her husband, Robert Durst, so that the sepulture lawsuit would proceed. The court granted the request, and Kathleen was declared dead in absentia in 2017. In 2021, Durst was among those listed in the Pandora Papers leak, exposing the offshore sheltering of financial assets by hundreds of political, business, and celebrity people. In 2012 and 2013, his family members sought and received restraining orders against him, saying that they were afraid of him. He was then charged with trespassing in New York City for walking in front of townhouses owned by his brother Douglas and other family members. He went on trial and was acquitted in December 2015. The judge also vacated the 13 orders of protection his family members had taken out on him. In July 2014, he was arrested after turning himself into police following an incident at Houston CVS drugstore in which he allegedly exposed his genitalia without provocation and urinated on a rack of candy. He then left the store and casually walked down the street. He was charged with misdemeanor criminal mischief. In December 2014, he pleaded no contest and was fined $500. His lawyer, however, described the incident as a unfortunate medical mishap. A recording of the incident was released on videotape in 2015. Durst died of a cardiac arrest in the San Joaquin General Hospital in French Camp, California on the 10th of January 2022 at the age of 78. He'd been undergoing medical tests when he went into cardiac arrest and didn't respond to resuscitation. At the time of his death, he remained in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. In January 2022, McCormack's family filed a wrongful death suit against Durst's estate. This was the fourth similar civil suit the family had filed since 2015, attempting to claim all or part of Robert Durst's assets. In response, a federal judge in the Southern District of New York ruled that Durst's second wife and heir, Deborah Charton, may not do anything with his $100 million estate. The court documents say Charton and or her attorney must appear in court on the 25th of March 2022 and show cause why the order should not be issued. In March 2023, a federal court judge ruled that the case of wrongful death filed by Kathy Durst's family against the estate of Robert Durst could proceed. In this ruling, the judge wrote that the lawsuit filed was not ultimately because of Robert Durst's death. A conference was scheduled for April 2023. As of August 2025, the suit remains in the pre-trial phase, with active motion, practice and hearings taking place. No trial date has been set. Robert Berdella Jr. was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men, forcing his victims to endure periods of up to 6 weeks in captivity. His crimes took place in Kansas City, Missouri between 1984 and 1987, describing his murders as being He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Larry Pearson in August 1988. He would later plead guilty to one further charge of first-degree murder and 4 charges of second-degree murder in December 1988. He died of a heart attack whilst incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary in October 1992. He became known as the Kansas City Butcher due to his practice of extensively dissecting his victims' bodies, which he would then dispose of in garbage bags, and the name The Collector was due to the movie which he had stated was the basis of the fantasies behind the modus operandi of his crimes. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on the 31st of January 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, the first of 2 sons born to Robert Andrew Berdella Sr., a die setter for the Ford Motor Company, and Mary Louise Berdella. His father was a devout Roman Catholic of Italian descent, while his mother was of German and British descent. The family regularly attended Mass, and both sons regularly attended religious education courses. As a child, he was intelligent but a loner who rarely played outside of his home and rarely had friends visit to socialise. He had a speech impediment and wore thick glasses from the age of 5 because he was severely nearsighted. He was also diagnosed with blood pressure, for which he took several medications. He was largely unathletic, whereas his younger brother Daniel displayed an aptitude for sports from an early age. Berdella's father valued sports and physical education and viewed his older son's lack of interest in sports as a sign of failure, after comparing him unfavourably with his younger brother. Occasionally his father physically and emotionally abused his children, such as beating them with a leather strap. He performed well academically, though teachers often found him difficult to teach, partly due to his aloofness and being the recipient of bullying by other students. Because of this, he rarely socialised with his peers. When he reached puberty, he discovered that he was gay. Initially, he kept this fact a closely guarded secret and didn't become open about sexuality for several years. Nonetheless, in his early teens, he briefly had a girlfriend. By his mid-teens, he'd begun to display a degree of aggression, becoming rude and condescending to others, particularly women. He learned about cooking and art and developed showmanship. On Christmas Day 1965, the family drove to Canton, Ohio to visit relatives. That evening, his father had a heart attack at the age of 39. 2 days later, he returned to Cuyahoga Falls by himself. When he arrived home, his family told him that his father had passed away. He sought solace in his Catholicism, reading extensively about many faiths. He eventually became cynical about all religion. In 1965, he saw the film adaptation of the John Fowles novel The Collector. A description of the film is as follows. Clerk Freddie Clegg, Terence Stamp, an avid butterfly collector, wins a football pool and buys a country house with a large basement. He then kidnaps art student Miranda Gray, Samantha Edgar, a longtime crush of his. After trailing her in a van, Freddie locks Miranda in the basement and buys her clothes and books so that she can get to know him. They initially agree that she will stay at the house for a month, but Miranda fears what will happen when the time comes for her to leave. Berdella stated that this movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Shortly after the death of his father, his mother remarried, which Berdella resented, viewing it as a form of betrayal against his late father. As a result, he became increasingly withdrawn and further immersed himself in the activities he had participated in since childhood, such as painting, collecting coins and stamps, and writing to foreign pen pals. He would later claim that his hobby of writing to pen pals in countries such as Vietnam and Burma, and them sending him stamps and photographs of mythical and historical icons, ancient cultures, and architecture, would lead to his avid interest in primitive art, photographs, and antiques. From approximately 1965, he began collecting such artifacts. This practice would inspire him to open his own antiques business in 1982. In the summer of 1967, he graduated from the Cuyahoga Falls High School. Throughout his studies in high school, he had earned such excellent grades and showed such potential that in 1966, one teacher had placed him in an independent study program. Shortly after his graduation, he relocated to Kansas City, enrolling in the Kansas City Art Institute with aspirations of becoming a college professor. In his first year at the KCAI, he was considered an attentive and talented student, although in his second year he became vocally anti-authoritarian, becoming acquainted with a clique of students who supplied him with drugs, which he then sold to other students at a profit. He then began regularly abusing alcohol. He also engaged in acts of animal torture on at least 2 occasions. During one of these instances, he decapitated a duck in the presence of his peers, and in the second he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. At the age of 19, he was arrested for attempting to sell methamphetamine to an undercover officer. However, he was released after posing a $3,000 bond, equivalent to about $27,100 as of 2025. He would later plead guilty and was handed a 5-year suspended sentence. However, only 1 month after his first arrest, along with 2 other students, they were arrested for possession of marijuana and LSD in Johnson County. On this occasion, Berdella couldn't post bond, and he spent 5 days in jail as a result. The charges against him and one other student would be dropped due to a lack of evidence. In 1969, Berdella voluntarily withdrew from KCAI after receiving harsh criticism from college administrators for killing and cooking a duck for the sake of art. He chose to remain in Kansas City, and in September of that year, he moved into an address within the Hyde Park district, 4315 Charlotte Street. By this stage, he had been openly gay for several years. He began spending much of his time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, petty criminals, and runaways. He would typically befriend these individuals, then try to help free them from their drug addictions or criminal lifestyles, though he was adamant that, throughout much of the 1970s, he had no physical contact whatsoever with any of them. To several of his neighbours, he stated that he felt almost like a foster parent to many of the youths. By the early 1980s, many of his older acquaintances had stopped having any form of social contact with him. He increasingly relied on the young men as a source of companionship and friendship. He would later claim to have become increasingly frustrated that many of these individuals were ignorant of his efforts to help steer them away from self-destructive behaviour. Despite these later claims, he would often engage in sexual relationships with the men he befriended and would establish a degree of control over them, in part to engage in these sexual relations by loaning them money and allowing them to live rent-free at his house for periods of time. To his neighbours, he was considered flamboyant yet helpful and civic-minded, despite the generally unkept state of his property and his somewhat haughty attitude. In the beginning of the 1970s, he worked with the South Hyde Park Crime Prevention and Neighbourhood Association, becoming the chairman in the early 1980s and encouraging neighbourhood watch patrols. He remained active in the association until the mid-1980s, where he left his position. He also volunteered at fundraising events for a local public television station until the mid-1980s. Shortly before he moved into his Charlotte Street address, he began working as a short-order cook in various restaurants around Kansas City, in part to help pay lawyer fees and fines accrued from his previous drug arrest. For additional income, he also sold art and antiques he had collected from contacts he had established in Africa, Asia, South America, and various Pacific Rim countries. He initially operated this side business from home. Both his cooking career and the antiques business flourished. By the mid-1970s, he began working as a senior cook at several renowned Kansas City restaurants. He joined a chefs association and helped establish a training program for aspiring chefs at a local community college. At the same time, he devoted more attention to his own business. By 1981, he had established several contractual agreements with both national and international contacts for his antiques business. He viewed this as his full-time job and later quit working as a chef. In 1982, Berdella began renting his own booth at the Westport Flea Market. The store was named Bob's Bizarre, and and primarily sold and traded primitive art, jewellery and antiques. Although occasionally making a generous monthly profit, the income from his business was insufficient to maintain his expenses and make ends meet. As a result, he would occasionally steal or scavenge items to sell at his booth. He would also take lodgers at his home as a means of gaining additional income. At the flea market, he became acquainted with a fellow merchant named Paul Howell, who operated a booth adjacent to his own. Soon, Berdella became acquainted with Paul Howell's younger son, Jerry. Initially, Jerry Howell and his friends taunted Berdella for his overt homosexuality, although according to Berdella, Jerry Howell later confided to him that he and his friends occasionally earned money as male prostitutes. By the early 1980s, Paul Howell had relocated his business to a store close to the intersection of 39th and Main Street, with his family living in an apartment above the shop. Berdella remained a casual friend of the family, offering his assistance if Jerry encountered any minor scrapes with the law. Berdella is believed to have killed his first victim on the 5th of July 1984, 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Berdella had promised to drive Howell to attend a dancing contest in Merriam. According to Berdella, he plied Howell with alcohol diazepam and acetylmazarine, both in his car and at his house, until he became unconscious. He then injected Howell with a heavy tranquilizer before binding him to his bed. Howell was restrained to Berdella's bed for approximately 28 hours. Throughout his period of captivity, Berdella repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated him with foreign objects, repeatedly ignoring Howell, asking why he was being treated this way, and his pleas to be freed. According to Berdella, Jerry Berdella will later state that he briefly attempted to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation upon Howell after he had died, then dragged his body to the basement. He suspended the body above a large cooking pot and made several incisions to his inner elbows and the jugular vein, leaving the body suspended in the position overnight to allow the blood to drain from his body. The following day, he dismembered Howell's body using a chainsaw and boning knives and wrapped the sections in newspaper and trash bags. These bags were later placed inside larger trash bags, which Berdella placed outside for a garbage crew to collect and take away to a landfill site. When later questioned by officers investigating Howell's disappearance, Berdella claimed to have driven him to Merriam as promised, where they then parted company close to Howell's intended destination. Berdella further claimed that he'd not seen him since. As would be the case with all of Berdella's murders, he kept a detailed log in which he documented each act of sexual and physical torture inflicted upon his victim. He would recall that, like his subsequent victims, Howell had repeatedly pleaded with him to stop the abuse of torture, although Berdella would either ignore the pleas, taunt him, or threaten him. He would remain adamant to investigators that he did not do this for his enjoyment, but for what he called his physical and mental satisfaction. On the 10th of April 1985, a former lodger, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, arrived on Berdella's doorstep, asking if he could stay at his house for a short time. According to Berdella, although Sheldon paid his rent responsibly, he considered him to be an inconvenience. Although he was not physically attracted to Sheldon, on the 12th of April, he drugged and held him captive because he returned home from work to find Sheldon intoxicated. Berdella was adamant that he held no firm malice towards Sheldon, but saw him as someone whom he could Sheldon was drugged with sedatives and held captive in the second-floor bedroom for 3 days, enduring forms of torture such as swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye, the insertion of needles beneath his fingertips, the binding of his wrists with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. 3 days after Berdella had begun holding Sheldon captive, on the 15th of April, a workman came to perform scheduled work on the roof of his home, leading Berdella to fatally suffocate Sheldon by placing a sack over his head, which he then tightened with a piece of rope. He then dissected Sheldon's body on the third-floor bathroom. The following June, Berdella found Mark Wallace, a very casual acquaintance who had previously helped him with yard work, hiding in his tool shed to seek shelter from a severe thunderstorm. As had been the case with Robert Sheldon, Berdella invited him inside his house and, noting Wallace's acute state of tenseness and depression, volunteered to inject him with chlorpromazine with the explanation that it would calm down and relax him. Wallace willingly accepted the offer and, 30 minutes later, Berdella decided to render him captive. Wallace was carried to the second-floor bedroom where he endured almost a day of captivity, and torture included the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks to the body at any point which Wallace began regressing into a state of unconsciousness. According to Berdella, 1 hour after his experimenting with hypodermic needles by inserting them into various muscles upon Wallace's back, Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. He noted his time of death as being 7 p.m. on the 23rd of June. On the 22nd of September 1985, Berdella answered a phone call from an acquaintance named James Ferris, who asked to stay at his home for a short time. Berdella agreed with the intention of kidnapping him, whom he arranged to meet at a bar that evening. Despite the brutality to which he had subjected to his first 3 victims, Berdella claimed that Ferris was the first victim upon he intentionally inflicted torture. He also informed investigators that there were occasions during his final 3 victims' periods of captivity when he ceased making additions to his abuse logs because he assumed the victim would not be able to make it much longer. Berdella brought Ferris home and drugged him with crushed tranquilizers concealed in a meal, then tied him to his bed before torturing him for almost constantly for approximately 27 hours. The torture included the repeated administration of 7,700 volt electrical shocks to the shoulder and testicles for up to 5 minutes in each incident, and acupuncture via hypodermic needles to the neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious, but Berdella continued his physical and sexual assaults until he noted in his log that Ferris was unable to sit up more than 10 to 15 seconds. The next entry read, and finally, Berdella noted that Ferris died with a slang term that he'd used in his career as a chef, 86, which Berdella later explained meant anything from throw it out to stop the project. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old drug addict and occasional prostitute who, with his wife, had twice lived briefly at Berdella's house in 1984. After Stoops and his wife moved out of Berdella's home the second time, Berdella didn't see him again until a chance encounter at the Kansas City's Liberty Memorial Park on the 17th of June 1986. Berdella invited him to his house with an offer of lunch, with an added incentive of sex, as Stoops stated that he needed $13 to purchase drugs, the equivalent of about $37 as of 2025. Berdella would later stress to investigators that he'd been extremely physically attracted to Stoops, and he was held captive for 2 weeks before he died. He gradually increased Stoops' terror, attempting to make him cooperative and an incapacitated sex slave. Berdella used electrical shocks through Stoops' closed eyes in an attempt to blind him, and injected drain cleaner into his larynx to try to silence his screaming. During the second week of his capture, Stoops asked Berdella for a soft drink and a sandwich. When Berdella refused, Stoops burst into tears. On the 27th of June, he ruptured Stoops' anal wall with his fist, causing bleeding and discharge. Towards the end of Stoops' captivity, he tried to feed him ice cream and soup, although Stoops wasn't able to keep anything down. By the final day of his captivity, Stoops was so weak, Berdella later stated that he had been able to breathe in a sitting position. On the 1st of July 1986, Stoops died. A forensic pathologist later testified that the ruptured anal wall caused septic shock, which proved fatal. In the spring of 1987, Berdella became friendly with 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson. This casual friendship began when Pearson entered his shop and explained to Berdella that, as a child, he had held an interest in both witchcraft and wizardry. Shortly thereafter, Pearson temporarily lodged with Berdella and willingly performed chores around his home as a means of paying rent. According to Berdella, he didn't initially intend to capture Pearson, but began forming the plan to do so on the 23rd of June, 2 weeks after having bailed Pearson out of jail, and noting Pearson, in the weeks prior to his captivity, displayed little interest in finding a job. On the afternoon on the 23rd of June, Berdella and Pearson watched the movie Creepshow 2 before eating lunch. As they drove around Kansas, the young man began jokingly referring to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. This disclosure finalized Berdella's decision to hold Pearson captive. That evening, Berdella ensured Pearson became intoxicated before injecting him with chlorphorazepine and moving him down to his basement, where he bound Pearson's hands above his head, then linked the rope he had used for this purpose to a brick column before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. He then brought an electrical transformer into the basement. According to Berdella, Pearson was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. On the 5th day of his captivity, having by this stage endured torture such as the repeated administration of electrical shocks with the transformer and the breaking of several hand bones with an iron rod to render him submissive, Berdella deduced Pearson had earned his trust as to his continued cooperation in his sexual and physical abuse. As a form of reward, Pearson was moved to the 2nd floor, with Berdella first informing Pearson that if he continued to cooperate, he would not continue to inflict as much pain upon him as he had done so while he was held captive in the basement. Throughout the latter part of his 6 weeks of captivity, Parson trained himself to sleep without moving so that he didn't antagonize Berdella and thus invite further torture to return to the basement. After 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson deeply bit into Berdella's penis before screaming that he couldn't continue to tolerate his ongoing poor treatment. In response, Berdella killed Pearson by bludgeoning him into unconsciousness with a tree limb, then suffocating him with a bag and ligature before driving to the hospital to receive treatment for his wound. Pearson's body was later dismembered in the basement, and his head initially stored in a plastic bag inside Berdella's freezer before being buried in the backyard. At 1 a.m. on the 29th of March 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson, whom he lured to his house upon the promise of payment for sex. At Berdella's home, Bryson was knocked unconscious with an iron bar, then bound to Berdella's bed, where he was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture endured by previous victims, although in Bryson's case, Berdella repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia before exclaiming to him, After several days, Berdella explained to Bryson that he'd begun to trust his captive, and that although he was willing to discuss some aspects of the abuse and torture he was receiving, there would be no negotiations regarding his sexual abuse. Berdella finished this discussion with a stern warning. By the third day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Berdella to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after his sexual abuse rather than to the bed above his head, upon the excuse that his doing so was restricting the circulation to his arms. He'd also persuaded Berdella to leave a television on in the room, with the remote control placed between his legs whenever Berdella was out of the room. Bryson later stated to investigators that he thought almost constantly about escaping. The following day, he managed to break free of his restraints by burning through them with a book of matches Berdella had inadvertently left in the room within his reach when he'd left the house to go to work. Wearing nothing but a dog collar, Bryson managed to escape from the house by jumping from a second-floor window, breaking a bone in his foot. He ran towards a meter reader who was walking down the other side of the street, shouting for him to call the police. The meter reader led Bryson to the house which he had been approaching. The occupants called the police, who arrived minutes later. Questioned at the scene by 4 officials, Bryson initially claimed that he had been hitchhiking when abducted by Berdella, who had kidnapped, raped, and tortured him for 4 days before escaping by jumping from a window on the second floor of the property. Berdella had kept him bound on the bed on the second floor of the house throughout much of the time, repeatedly sodomizing him, drugging him, and injecting his throat with drain cleaner to diminish his ability to speak loudly. As Bryson spoke, the officers also noted that in addition to the dog collar and broken foot, Bryson had red, swollen eyes and visible scars and welts across his entire body. 2 officers were told to maintain discreet surveillance of the property. Bryson was driven to the Menorah Medical Center for treatment, accompanied by a 3rd officer, while the 4th officer radioed the Kansas City Police Department to request a formal search warrant of the property. During later questioning by the KCPD, Bryson divulged that his captor had shown him Polaroid pictures of men who appeared to be deceased, and that he was told that he would never leave the property, and that if he became a nuisance or threat, he would either be subjected to greater levels of torture than what he'd already endured, or simply be killed. On the afternoon of Bryson's escape, Berdella was arrested on charges of pertaining to the sexual assault of Christopher Byron. He declined to allow officers inside his home, but the earlier requested warrant to search his property was drafted, and the officers gained access to the property the same day. Corroborating Bryson's claims of being restrained and tortured on the second-floor bedroom, investigators discovered the bedroom on the second floor had burnt ropes attached to the posts and foot of the bed. Also in the room was an electrical transformer plugged into the wall with wires leading to the bed. A metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs and eye drops were also close to the bed. He also found in the room were a long iron pipe, various lengths of rope, and leather belts. Investigators also noted that the posts on the bed had been extensively worn, suggesting that restraints had earlier been tied to them, and that the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves. Searching the house and the grounds of 4315 Charlotte Street, investigators uncovered a human skull inside a closet on the second floor of this property, and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. The search also uncovered several human vertebrae, scarred by both hacksaw and knife marks stowed in a hallway, and several human teeth stowed in 2 envelopes. Both a hacksaw and a miter saw were discovered in the basement of the property, and a chainsaw was also found to be soiled with bloodstains, flesh, and pubic hairs. Luminal tests revealed that the floor of Berdella's basement and 2 plastic trash barrels were extensively blood-stained. 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various men were also found in Berdella's house. These pictures showed Christopher Byron and several other men, both in life and death. Many of the images had been taken while the men were being tortured. The search also uncovered numerous restraints and sexual devices, pornographic literature, hypodermic needles, and a book on narcotics. Officers also discovered a stenographer's pad containing detailed torture logs that Berdella had maintained for each victim, lying on top of a chest of drawers. Several newspaper clippings from the Kansas City Star mentioned a missing young man named Jerry Howell, and a wallet and driver's license belonging to a missing person named James Ferris were discovered in a closet on the second floor of the property. Before the search of Berdella's property had concluded, the KCPD assembled a special task force of 11 detectives and 1 sergeant to focus exclusively on the Berdella case. This task force extensively researched Berdella's history, discovering that he was well known among the Kansas City's male hustlers, having earned a reputation for preying on transient young men. Several of these male prostitutes were also reluctant to accept him as a client, both because of his penchant for drugging, injecting and torturing his sexual partners and acquaintances, and also because he had long been considered a suspect in the disappearance of 2 men whose personal possessions had been found in the house, Jerry Howell and James Ferris. Missing person reports had been filed for both these men, and Berdella had been extensively questioned in relation to the disappearances. He denied having anything to do with the disappearances. Despite being considered a prime suspect in both cases and being placed under surveillance, police had been unable to find any solid evidence linking him to either man's disappearance. In both instances, after giving his initial statement to police, Berdella indignantly refused to talk further without having a lawyer present. His lawyer would later threaten to file harassment accusations against the police unless their questioning and surveillance of him ceased. James Ferris's wife identified him in several Polaroids found at Berdella's property, some taken after her husband's death. Paul Howell formerly identified a picture of a young man hanging upside down in Berdella's basement as his son. Several other Polaroid images depicted as yet unidentified young men, and several detectives were assigned to identify them to determine that if they were alive or dead, and if alive, the circumstances of the picture. Since several of these images depicted a section of the body of the photographer, on the 13th of April, Berdella was ordered to pose nude for a series of photographs in the same precise angles as the evidence photos for comparison with the original Polaroid images. As numerous male names had been found scrawled upon various stenographers' pads at Berdella's address, the detectives began attempting to trace each of them. One of those traced, a young man named Freddie Kellogg, was able to state to detectives that he and several other young men had intermittently lodged with Berdella since the early 1980s, and that Berdella had been in the habit of plying his lodgers with drugs, typically intravenously, before engaging in sex with them, regardless of if they consented or not. Kellogg stated that in order for him to be allowed to lodge with Berdella, he must agree to persuade young men whom Berdella found attractive to attend parties at Charlotte Street so that Berdella could drug them. Should Berdella ever discover that any of them was a police informant, he would use this knowledge to blackmail them. Despite this threat, Kellogg stated that numerous male prostitutes and addicts had been reluctant to engage in any form of contact with Berdella because of numerous of his links to the 1984 disappearance of Jerry Howell. In addition to these disclosures, Kellogg was able to name 3 of the men depicted in the Polaroids as Todd Stoops, Robert Sheldon, and Larry Wayne Pearson. The investigators would discover that Berdella had paid a $30 fee to secure a bond for Pearson in June 1987, the equivalent of about $83 in 2025, and that no further records existed to indicate that Pearson was still alive. Nonetheless, investigators did discover that in August 1987, Berdella had filed an assault report from a hospital room alleging that a man named Larry Pearson had deeply bitten into his penis during oral sex, causing a serious laceration. An interview with Robert Sheldon's employees at a Kansas City manufacturing plant confirmed that although the young man had been a reliable employee, he had suddenly ceased attending work in April 1985. Shortly after the search of 4315 Charlotte Street had concluded, Berdella was informed of the discoveries at his property. The same afternoon, he was ordered to pose for the series of nude photographs for comparison with the Polaroid images he had taken. Investigators attempted to conduct their first formal investigation with him, although Berdella simply invoked his right to silence in the setting. Investigators later sought to obtain handwriting samples from Berdella in an effort to prove that he'd written the notes found within the various stenographer's pads discovered at his house, he refused to cooperate and was sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. Initially, Berdella was formally charged with 1 count of felonious restraint, 1 count of assault, and 7 counts of forcible sodomy, as investigators continued their investigation into the discoveries at his property. He was assigned a temporary public defender as his legal representative and held in protective custody in the Jackson County Jail in lieu of a $500,000 bail, the equivalent of approximately $2 million as of 2025. In late April, the skull found inside Berdella's closet was identified via dental x-rays obtained via a subpoena from the University of Kansas Medical Center as that of Robert Sheldon. The same day, a dental identification was made on Sheldon's skull. 2 men separately phoned the Kansas City Police Department to state one of the 7 unidentified young men depicted in a photographic array released to the media on the 27th of April was a former high school acquaintance of theirs named Mark Wallace. When a detective contacted Wallace's sister, she stated that her brother had been missing since mid-1985. Shortly thereafter, investigators discovered that photograph D, released to the media in the same array, was one Larry Wayne Pearson. As Pearson had once been a ward of the court in Wichita, his dental records were available to be compared with the skull found in Berdella's backyard. Berdella would be formally charged with the murder and dismemberment of Larry Wayne Pearson in July, after the head discovered in his backyard was formally identified as Pearson's on the 12th of May. Prosecutors had gathered sufficient circumstantial evidence to accompany the physical evidence retrieved. On the 22nd of July 1988, a grand jury formally indicted Berdella for the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. The following month, he was arraigned and pleaded guilty in the 4th Circuit of the Jackson County Court before Judge Alvin C. Randall to the first-degree murder of Larry Pearson. The plea was entered following a late morning recess in the arraignment hearing into this particular murder and came as a surprise to both the judge and prosecuting attorneys. The prosecution team assigned to the case accepted the plea, with Assistant Prosecutor Pat Hall later explaining this decision as being in the best interest of our client, the people of the state of Missouri. Following the submission and acceptance of this plea, the judge insisted that Berdella confess under oath as to Pearson's death. In response to being questioned by his attorneys, Berdella stated, when asked if he performed this act deliberately and with malice aforethought, he simply stated, yes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Upon being sentenced, he was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary to commence his life sentence. He would later be temporarily placed in protective custody at the Potosi Correctional Center due to concerns for his safety. A second guilty plea submitted before the Jackson County Court on the 24th of August earned Berdella a further life term without parole for 1 charge of forcible sodomy against Christopher Bryson, 6 counts of sodomy, and 1 charge of assault. Being dropped as part of a plea bargain, he would also receive a further term of 7 years pertaining to 1 count of felonious restraint against Bryson on the state. Despite initially pleading not guilty to the remaining 5 murder charges on the 13th of September 1988, with the agreement of his 2 defense attorneys, Berdella ultimately conducted a plea bargain with the prosecutors in order to avoid the death penalty in these remaining charges. In this plea bargain, he agreed to confess in graphic detail as to whom he had killed, what indignities he had inflicted upon each victim, how he had killed each victim, and what he had done with their bodies. These confessions were given to prosecutors between the 13th and 15th of December 1988. In return for his cooperation, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty at a formal hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. on the 19th of December. On the 19th of December 1988, he formally waived his rights to be tried for any of the outstanding murder charges, upon the understanding that he was to be convicted of 1 further count of first-degree murder, that of Robert Sheldon, and 4 counts of second-degree murder. He formally pleaded guilty to each of these charges before Judge Robert Myers in the Jackson County Circuit Court. Members of the public were prohibited from attending this hearing, with only family members of the victims and news reporters permitted access to these proceedings. In response to the guilty pleas, Judge Myers imposed 5 further concurrent life sentences, with an additional condition barring any future prospect of parole in the sole case of first-degree murder to which Berdella pleaded guilty. He provided testimony to prosecutors between the 13th and 15th of December after he changed his plea and sought approval of their agreement to not seek the death penalty against him if he fully confessed. In this testimony, he claimed the movie he had first seen in 1965, The Collector, had left a major impression on him. Following the senses of shock and disgust he claimed to have initially experienced after killing his first victim, the movie had resurfaced in his memory and subsequently became a motivating psychological force in the actions he exhibited against his victims in his subsequent murders. His victims, he later stated to investigators, had lost any degree of humanity in his eyes once he had chosen to render them captive. He confessed that many of the abbreviated entries within the torture logs were simply shorthand terms for methods of abuse he had inflicted, whereas others would describe either their reactions or these ongoing acts of abuse and torture, or his initial abbreviations upon viewing them when he entered the room where he'd kept them restrained. The entry reading CP, for example, referred to the chlorpromazine he had injected to assist in his restraining of the men, whereas entries reading DC referred to swabbing their eyes with drain cleaner, or the injection of the substance into their vocal cords. Entries reading EK or EKG referred to torture administered to his captives with electrical shocks, whereas several other entries contained the anatomical location where he administered the abuse or torture. For example, at one point in relation to James Ferris, he'd written an entry reading 2.5 KET-NK plus shoulder to indicate that he ejected 2.2 cubic centimeters of ketamine into Ferris's neck and shoulder. Other entries such as gag loose, no resist in retie, or very delayed breathing, snoring were more self-explanatory. Investigators consulted a specialist in toxicology in their investigation into Berdella following his arrest, who stated that, judging by the notes he had written about Robert Sheldon, the accumulation of chlorpromazine injected into him had been toxic. Furthermore, Berdella confessed to having alternatively buried two victims' heads in his backyard, adding that he retrieved and cleaned the first skull, that of Robert Sheldon, at the time he buried Larry Pearson's head in the same hole. Sheldon's skull was that which he placed inside a closet on the second floor in his property in an area of the household Berdella referred to as my gallery area. He removed the teeth from the skull and kept them stowed inside envelopes. He further claimed to have intended to retrieve Pearson's skull once sufficient time had elapsed for it to skeletonize, although he was adamant that there had been no rational or sinister reason for him doing so. In addition, he vehemently denied media rumours that he'd been engaged in any form of Satanism or that he sold sections of the bodies in his flea market booth. He was able to name all of his victims to investigators. Although Mark Wallace had been seized by opportunity when Berdella had found him seeking shelter from a severe thunderstorm in his tool shed, his other 5 victims had been captured after he unsuccessfully tried to steer them away from their general lifestyles, and thus simply became frustrated at the failure of his efforts. Regarding each victim's captivity, he described in graphic detail the sexual, physical, and emotional abuse he had subjected to each individual, and which he had recorded within his torture log. He explained his successive actions to investigators on the 14th of December with a statement that he was Nonetheless, he did claim that he tried to prevent any of his victims from developing any form of malnutrition or infection by occasionally administering antibiotics or nutrients intravenously as his abuse and torture escalated. The methods of torture exhibited against his victims had included the administration of high-voltage electrical shocks, starvation, the application of alkali-based detergents into their throats, vocal cords, or eyes, and the bludgeoning of their hands with the intention of rendering these body parts unusable. One other method of torture was the insertion of needles beneath their fingernails. Furthermore, he confessed that the level of abuse he inflicted had increased with each successive victim, and that he viewed the Polaroid images that he had taken of his victims as being a trophy or record of the event. Although police extensively searched for the remains of his victims throughout their initial investigation into his crimes, the confession he provided to investigators that in the autumn of 1988 confirmed that he dismembered the bodies of all 6 of his victims, confirmed that the dismembered bodies of all 6 of his victims had been stowed in trash bags and taken to unknown landfill sites. Their bodies were never recovered. In the years following his 1988 convictions and incarceration, Berdella granted an interview to the Missouri-based television station KCPT and corresponded with numerous individuals. To all concerned, he attempted to restore his image as a sensitive citizen who had simply made mistakes in committing his crimes. He further claimed that he'd been demonised unfairly by the media before, during, and after his arraignments and plea bargains, and that police ineptitude had resulted in his being allowed to remain at liberty following his first murder. He also lodged several complaints with the prison officials regarding his prison conditions. He also wrote several letters to a local minister claiming that prison officials knew of his high blood pressure, yet were not providing him with prescribed heart medication. In 1992, Berdella contacted Reverend Roger Coleman, whom he had met when he was first incarcerated, relaying his distress that the staff at the Missouri State Penitentiary were withholding his heart medication. At 2 p.m. on the 8th of October 1998, he complained to prison staff of severe heart pains and was taken from his cell to the prison infirmary. Medical staff determined that his heart was unstable and called an ambulance. He was taken to a hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where he was pronounced dead from a heart attack at 3:55 p.m. He was 43 years old. Shortly after the judge at his trial, Alvin Randall was informed of his death. In response, Randall sarcastically remarked, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." According to published reports, although Berdella had a depressive personality disorder, he was also a diagnosed sexual sadist who gained extreme sexual excitation from the humiliation, pain, and torture to which he subjected his victims. Moreover, despite his claims to journalists that he had contacted in the years of his incarceration, he never expressed any degree of remorse for his actions and even referred to his victims as play toys in an interview he granted shortly before his death. In November 1988, auctions of his vast collection of artifacts and furniture confiscated from his home and business were held on 4 separate dates, with the intention that all proceeds raised at the auctions to be used to pay his mounting legal fees within then ongoing legal proceedings. The auction attracted considerable national interest, receiving telephone bids from across the US. Although many items sold for less than the expected price, by the end of the first day's auctioneering alone, more than $60,000 had been raised, equivalent to $160,000 in 2025. His house was purchased by a local businessman for an undisclosed sum in December 1988. The property was later demolished. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Are there any other true crime cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel? If so, let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts and opinions about this case? Also let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next Friday at 5 o'clock with another true crime case.